Okay, here we are. We're back. We're live. And we're talking about global connections today. More specifically, we're talking with Michael Davis, who's a professor of constitutional law and human rights at the University of Hong Kong, and he joins us by Skype. Thank you for joining us, Michael. It's nice to have you on the show.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. You become, since I saw you last, you've become an international figure, if you weren't already an international figure. I've seen you on all the major global news services, giving interviews about what is going on in the streets of Hong Kong. And I would say from my observation of that there's nobody who is more in the limelight on this issue than you are.
Well, maybe outside of Hong Kong. Here in town, of course, our news is in Cantonese, and there are a number of very well-spoken academics like myself and other public figures who are in the media and talking about this.
Well, it's rather than just having an update, or that's what I originally considered, I'd like to ask you about some of the things that have come up in the press and in the interviews to try to get a handle on, the larger processes and implications of what's going on. And it seems clear that the government in Beijing is controlling CY Leung. But at the end of the day, he's a public official who was elected by the people of Hong Kong. I mean, doesn't he pay a price for being an instrument of Beijing when the next election comes up?
Well, he's not elected. There's a so-called election committee, and this committee is a committee made up of pro-Beijing, or what they call pro-establishment figures. There's 1,200-member committee. In fact, what all the controversy in Hong Kong is about
Did you say 1,200-member committee?
Yes.
How can you get anything done with 1,200 people?
Well, basically, they just vote in this committee, and it's historically done Beijing's bidding. And what Beijing quietly signals, winks and nods, who it wants to be chosen. The last time there was a little controversy because Beijing was slightly favoring the other guy that was before the committee, and he got into some scandal just at the wrong moment, and so another pro-Beijing figure, CY Leung, then emerged. But there's usually little controversy because Beijing often hints at who it wants. So it's not an election by the public. But that's exactly what the controversy is about, because the basic law says the ultimate aim is universal suffrage upon nomination by a broadly representative nominating committee. And so the Beijing now has issued a ruling that says, well, the election committee, the same one effectively, that was the election committee and chose a small circle election of the chief executive, is now to become the nominating committee. And the protesters in Hong Kong object to this because they see this as a committee that will just vet candidates. And so when the universal suffrage is implemented for the first time and the voters are given a vote on the chief executive, then they lament that they only will be given a choice between these pro-Beijing figures and not a genuine election.
Yeah. It reminds me, Michael, last time I was in China, I met a lawyer, actually, and I asked her if she voted, and she said she did not vote. I said, why don't you vote? She said, because my vote means nothing. I vote for a committee, which in turn votes for a committee, which in turn votes for a committee, and it travels up to the Politburo, and by the time it gets up there, my vote has no consequence at all. And therefore, I recognize this as a charade. It's not really voting, it's not really democracy, and I'm not going to vote in a system like that. That was her view of it. And it sounds like that's a culture point that Beijing wants to visit upon Hong Kong.
Yes, it's exactly right. And people are upset about it, that this kind of election would be proposed. It's sort of like Iran, where the Guardian Council vets the candidates that can run for the leader in that country. And so that's the objection, that it's not a genuine universal suffrage. China actually calls it universal suffrage, and then they started out this debate by accusing the Democrats in Hong Kong, who are the protesters now, of stopping Hong Kong from developing universal suffrage because they said, oh, one person, one vote. Well, the thing is the rest of the world thinks of universal suffrage as not just one person, one vote, but as your friend in China suggested, but that the vote count, that it involve a real choice between candidates. And that's, in effect, the problem, because if we treat universal suffrage as meaning just that everyone votes, then you could say China itself has universal suffrage because everyone can vote. So that I think is a very important distinction that Hong Kong people are focused on at the moment.
Well, it suggests there's a kind of a clash of systems here, because I think it's important to Beijing right now to perpetuate a system where you vote as a charade, and it isn't really democracy at all. And here it finds on its doorstep, from what is a very influential place. I'm sure that people in mainland China see Hong Kong as a seat of vitality, as a seat of innovation, as a world-class place to do business, as an entry port for so much business and investment in China, mainland China, that if they find that the protesters prevail in Hong Kong, they are going to be all the more unhappy with the way it works in mainland China. This in turn, we talked about this briefly before, this in turn is very threatening to Beijing. So the stakes for Beijing are the whole country. It's not just Hong Kong.
Yeah, I think Hong Kong has always been an issue for the country at large, in the sense that in this one country, two systems model, Hong Kong is way ahead of the rest of the country. But I think it may read too much into it, and I think Beijing officials may take the view you just had expressed, but it may read too much into it, because I think in many ways people in China have gotten used to the idea that Hong Kong is this free and open society with human rights and so on, and they come here in droves. We have more mainland tourists here than Hawaii has tourists, and they come here in droves, and they observe it, and there's no doubt this open society that they observe may have some shape their minds on what kind of system they might have. But for the most part, I think they view it separately, just like they view what's going on in the politics of the United States or Japan or somewhere else as something separate. So the one country, two systems framework has managed, allowed Beijing to separate and distinguish the Hong Kong case. Now, that doesn't mean that China won't feel pressure for democracy, but I think most of that pressure comes from within their system. That as the country has become wealthier and more successful and a middle class has emerged, their government will increasingly feel pressure for political reform, which it's constantly feeling. But I don't think it should view Hong Kong as some kind of threat, therefore we must repress Hong Kong. Yeah. I don't think that's a necessary conclusion, and I don't think I think people have gotten used to the idea that Hong Kong started out different, and it has this guarantee of difference.
Well, you know, I remember it said by one China expert who visited Hawaii and spoke in the China seminar a year or two ago. She said that in the Chinese culture, if you want to say history, the people always retain the right to upend the government if they're not satisfied the way things are working. And that means economically. So when you have an economy that is doing well, as it is mostly in mainland China, then it's less likely that there'll be effective calls for reform. But I give you the possibility that one of these days it may overheat. One of these days the economy may be undermined for any reason, either internal or external. And then that old tradition of taking issue with the government, upending the government, may come back into play. And Hong Kong would be an interesting object lesson for a movement of protest in mainland China.
Right, and this is true, and political economists have long predicted that when a country reaches a certain level of development, that, in fact, they go so far in many cases to use a kind of math that if the per capita income reaches so many $1,000s, that then people will demand political change and the country will slip into a more democratic form of government. So those pressures are all very much on China today. Yeah. And I think the regime does recognize that Hong Kong offers an opportunity to experiment with different options. But at the same time, they control, like most people in the mainland China today don't know anything about the umbrella movement in Hong Kong because it's all been suppressed in the media. So I think they successfully hive it off. And I think if there is a revolutionary change towards democracy in China, it won't be coming from Hong Kong, but from China itself.
Interesting. So, is it that the media in Hong Kong, which, I mean, we can see it, it is global, on a day-to-day basis, is not available? That media is not projecting into mainland China, and that the average Joe doesn't know exactly what's happening on the streets of Wan Chai?
Well, that's right. There's a lot of it that slips across the border, but China does, especially on social media, it has all these words blocked out. Now umbrella would be blocked out. And so, but there's, Chinese people are infinitely clever, and a lot of things do slip across the border. And because so many people come to Hong Kong to visit, that also they will bring back awareness. So in time, this stuff does appear, and you do see it sort of sticking its head up here and there in the social media. And near Hong Kong, in Guangdong province, which is a huge place with a population bigger than France, you see, of course, you'll see TV disc aimed towards Hong Kong. And so there's attempts to tap into the Hong Kong media, but the mainland government does try to control this.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned in one of your interviews, I don't remember if it was CNN or CBS or what, the idea that this is really a battle for the hearts and minds, and I guess it's the hearts and minds of the people who live in Hong Kong mostly, and maybe the hearts and minds of people who are outside of China and all this, watching from other places in the world. But how is the battle going, you think, in a battle for the hearts and minds? Which way is it tilting these days since we spoke a month ago? And with all of these events that have happened, all these protests and street demonstrations and camp out on major thoroughfares, I mean, how is the battle for the hearts and minds going?
It's a mixed bag. I think we know from an opinion poll that was just reported from the Chinese University of Hong Kong this week that there's actually the support for Occupy Central, for occupying the streets, actually has increased as of the date of that opinion poll. And this was a surprise to everyone. The data the last time we spoke was that about 53% want the Democrats in the Legislative Council, who have enough votes to veto any government proposal, to veto it. But only 30% at the time said they supported a civil disobedience campaign to occupy the streets, which in effect is purposefully breaking the law as a political campaign, and what we call civil disobedience. So there was this gap between pro-democracy and a willingness to take extreme measures like civil disobedience. Since that time, the civil disobedience campaign actually got launched first by the students, because they had a 1 week boycott of classes, and then they would meet in the area near the government offices and have speeches and stuff, and they tried to occupy an area called Civic Square, but the police expelled them from there using pepper gas and stuff. And then the police tried to restrict people's access to this area around the government offices, which is like a large park area. And they did try to, the protest people who had heard about pepper spray and stuff were trying to come, and they were all coming out of the train MTR, like a New York subway system, the MTR system, into this public space. And the police were blocking it. I was actually there when they were blocking it. So at some point, people pushed over the barriers the police had set up and went on to this main highway, which they now occupy and have Tent City on. And at that point, the police unleashed tear gas. And it's the first time there's ever done that people of Hong Kong were tear gassed since the handover. There had never been the use of tear gas. There had been one case where a WTO meeting had a number of Korean farmers that came, and they were unruly and they were the target of tear gas, but never had it been used against Hong Kong people. And so they, at that point, the public really jumped into action, and the streets were flooded by hundreds of thousands of people protesting. And so the government has lost round one for the battle for the hearts and minds of the people very badly. And so then the government stopped using tear gas and thought it would just wait out the protesters, and that so far hasn't succeeded either. But the protesters are also mindful that they're blocking public transport. People's going to work in the morning were experiencing difficulties and so on. Taxi drivers protesting, actually coming in and trying to protest against the protesters because their streets were blocked and they spent all their time in traffic. And so there's a kind of backlash against the protest.
So here we are essentially at the end of round one. And indeed, we're at the end of segment one in our program. We're going to take a short break, Michael. That's Michael Davis, Constitutional Law and Human Rights Professor at the University of Hong Kong, talking about what's going on in the streets of Hong Kong and how democracy is doing in this point in the process. We'll be right back.
Aloha, my name is Kenneth Lawson. I'm your host here at Life in the Law. I'm really interested in law as I practiced it for 18 years before coming to Hawaii. I practiced criminal law and civil rights law on the mainland. Now I teach law at the University of Hawaii Law School, William S. Richardson School of Law, and I bring in guests who are very current on legal issues that affect your life here in Hawaii. Come and join me every Wednesday at 1 p.m. as we explore how the law affects you, how the law is changing, and why it's important that you should care about what's going on in your community. See you then.
You're frozen.
Okay, we're back. We're live with Michael Davis, Constitutional Law and Human Rights Professor at the University of Hong Kong. We're trying to examine what exactly is going on, because this is, as he's mentioned, this is new. We're cutting new territory on this. Things are happening in these riots that have not ever happened before in Hong Kong, and it is worth studying them on many levels. So, you know, how is the crowd working? Who is in the crowd? How is the crowd being organized? What role does social media play? And how is the crowd sort of moving, as it were, through the city?
Well, it's interesting because, as I was saying, we were just closed a minute ago with this battle for the hearts and minds, and I was suggesting that protesters also have to be mindful that they, you know, how they conduct themselves, because if they're not, they could lose public support as well. Now, the opinion poll said that their support has gone up, so that was good news for them, that a majority of Hong Kong people actually support this protest now. But it's very interesting to watch on the street that they're the tidiest protesters I've ever seen. They actually have brigades to clean the streets. They don't even allow chewing gum on the streets. There's no trash. They set up food kiosks where, you know, you get free water bottles and stuff. They've got tents in nice rows like a town. And so this is all going on in the main protest area near what's called Admiralty. And when the police tried to cut back and shrink the space, the protesters occupied, and when the barriers were taken down, protesters put up new barriers, but the police sort of succeeded in shrinking some of the space for critical streets nearby. And so that they've sort of accepted that. But the biggest controversy has been in the very rugged area of Hong Kong called Mong Kok. There's 3 Occupy areas, and one of them is Mong Kok. And there, the protesters were attacked by thugs wearing masks.
By thugs, did you say?
Thugs, yeah, from triad societies.
Yeah.
Wearing masks. And so there were accusations bantered about that these thugs were mobilized by the police to push the protesters out, although there's no proof of that. And there were also some local merchants and stuff who have attacked the protesters. So not all the attacks on them have been from these thugs, but it was notorious that the thugs were involved. They were thought to be involved in those triad societies in this rougher end of town. So the protest occupation on a major thoroughfare in Mong Kok has had a lot more controversy. So the police were trying to clear it. They've even got court orders for them to withdraw, and they're told that they'll be held in contempt of court if they don't withdraw, and yet they're still there. And so that has been has more tension. Well, the protesters have avoided violence. There's been violence against them, both by these anti-Occupy people, and there's also been violence against them by the police using pepper spray and shields and hitting them with batons.
You know, this
And
reminds me so much of what I observed just a year ago in Istanbul. The way it was a very civil protest in a particular park in Istanbul. They were only talking about whether to build a shopping center in the park. That was the issue. And it took on all kinds of secondary effect. And the more the police used the batons and the pepper spray and the tear gas and the fire, rather the water cannon, the more aggravated the crowd got. And one of the things that's interesting that they did is, likewise, the police got thugs to come in and do things that they wouldn't do, to actually beat people up. And the crowd knew what was going on.
Here. I need to be clear that this is just, you know, how rumors go through the crowds and through the streets, but we don't know who has instigated these more aggressive sort of triad people to come in. We do know local merchants have been attacking the Occupy and taxi drivers and stuff, and they're, you know, honest folk who just don't like their jobs being obstructed. So there's a mix of people, but there have been people that are clearly identified. Even the police have acknowledged are thugs, but of course they don't have any. They claim not to have anything to do with that. So,
well, what about, you know, this is Hong Kong people, for 99%, I'm sure. They live in Hong Kong. They work in Hong Kong, and the police are likewise Hong Kong people. And how now you find people that, you know, have come from the same place. They're brethren in the city. They've grown up there, most of them, I guess, and they're looking each other in the eye. I mean, how do the police feel about this? Do they have a kind of conflict of interest?
Right. The police have been very uncomfortable with it. Actually, some officers, of course, may agree with the effort to suppress the protest, but others have not. And there have even been reports of some quitting their jobs because they want to leave the law enforcement of the protest and join the Occupy movement. And then there have also been just yesterday, a whole big signature campaign of government civil servants to support the Occupy movement, where they had to hide their names and ID numbers, but they have come out in support of the protesters. So there, I think a majority of Hong Kong people, probably a very strong majority, are very worried about Beijing interfering too much in Hong Kong, and Hong Kong losing its vibrancy and its essential character. And so I think the protest has a lot of support, but like anything else, when you have inconvenience, there's also a lot of skepticism that Beijing will change its mind in any way. So maybe this is all futile. So that would be one reason for not supporting the protest, because you're wasting our time, and so on. So there's a lot of mixed and very complex feelings associated with this.
Well, what do you give for the possibility that a little violence begets more violence, and that the crowd could become irrational, that the police could be reactive, and that we could have an escalation here? It's been going on for what, a month? And these things do not stay static; they change one way or the other. So, what do you give in the prospect of escalating violence?
Yeah, there are people who have worried that riots will start emerging, especially in the protest area in Mongkok, because of this tension that has occurred between various forces, as I just described it a moment ago. I think the protesters have been very disciplined. They keep sticking to their discipline of not using violence. So the most that's come out of them is when they've been pushed back, that they sometimes push back. But they often just hold their hands up, go like this, that they're not engaged in violence. So, but there have been this phenomenon of people attacking them, and the police sometimes use aggressive measures if they become very determined to clear an area. So this has been a problem.
You mentioned there are three protest areas, and I guess that's all on Hong Kong Island, so to speak.
Well, two on Hong Kong Island, one on Kowloon side of the harbor.
Okay. So how is this affecting daily life? I mean, can I go to the grocery store? Can I go to work? Is the day-to-day economy of the city affected? How does the ordinary working stiff react to this?
Well, it's interesting because it initially, when the protest area was wider, it had a bigger effect on daily life, but it's been shrunk a bit now, so it's now having sort of local effect in the Mongkok Street area where that one Occupy movement is at. It has effect on local merchants and so on. And the area near Causeway Bay, which is more of a touristy shopping area, the protest has been shrunk back so it only blocks one direction in the main street there. So it doesn't have much effect now. It's like a little, I don't know, fair or something going on there. And then the main protest area still blocks the major thoroughfare. So I think for the most part, it hasn't had a big effect on the economy. But now the protesters are announcing boycott of pro-Beijing businesses, so it could have effect on those businesses. The bigger effect, I think, the government has liked to say the Occupy movement will hurt Hong Kong, but really it's what Beijing's decision that has a bigger chance of hurting Hong Kong. If the rule of law in Hong Kong is put at risk and so on, that could have a long-term effect on Hong Kong. But so far, the reports on the economy have been that it's going the same as usual. And so it's just the inconveniences caused that affect the average guy on the street.
How about you? What effect has it had on your daily life? You take a bus to work, and
Yeah.
you teach with students who may be, sympathetic or involved in the riots. How has your life changed, Michael?
Yeah, it's just an Occupy movement, not riots. There have been none of those yet. Well, it had some effect. The first time when that other thoroughfare was blocked, then I had to go to a different location to catch the final bus that I needed to take. And then there's the boycott of classes. Well, I accommodated it by recording my lectures. I give a series of lectures in a first-year course, so I recorded them so the students who weren't present could, and the university actually helped us to do this. So the students who were boycotting could then watch it on the platform, the internet platform we have called Moodle. So it's been some effect, and I think my life has been more affected because I'm involved with the media a lot. So getting hoarse and losing my voice at times when this was at its height. But I think for the most part, I don't think the inconvenience at this stage is that great for ordinary people.
Yeah, one more thing is when you walk into a classroom of students teaching constitutional law, human rights law, I mean, the very issues that are at stake here in this whole controversy. Do you teach what's going on in the street? Do you examine with your students what's happening out there? And what kind of feedback do you get from in the context of your classes?
No, that's exactly what we do, because in this first year course where we team teach, I'm the guy assigned, it's called legal system, and I'm a guy that's assigned to teach 2 weeks of what's called one country, two systems. And so literally my assignment as in my weeks that I teach was directly on point with the protest. In fact, I then had a midterm assignment where they're supposed to assess the decisions that were made by Beijing in terms of how they would impact the rule of law. So it's very directly on point, and we've had very interesting discussions. As you might imagine, some students were boycotting because the boycott applied. Other students that didn't boycott supported the boycott, and some were skeptical about whether the boycott would produce any good consequences. It turned out those 2 weeks on one country, two systems were actually the first 2 weeks of the protest, so it was kind of locked into the height of this. So it was quite interesting to talk to Hong Kong students.
What a perfect confluence for you, really. It's like everything is coming, down to this fantastic confluence on constitutional law and human rights. Anyway, let's take a short break. When we come back, I'd like to talk about and I put it in quotes, the negotiations that are ostensibly going on that will lead one way or the other. That's Michael Davis, constitutional law and human rights professor at the University of Hong Kong, reporting to us on the events there regarding the controversy over voting and democracy. We'll be right back after this short break.
Aloha, I'm Keli'i Akina, president of the Grassroots Institute. One of the things I love being, however, is the host of the weekly program on ThinkTech Hawaii called Ehana Kako, which means let's work together. I get to interview movers and shakers in our town and across the world so that you and I together can learn and to grow. Please join me every Monday from 2 to 3 p.m. or watch us on the recording, www.thinktechhawaii.com. Aloha and Ehana Kako. Let's work together.
We're back. We're live. We're here with Michael Davis, who is teaching constitutional law and human rights at the University of Hong Kong and has reported to us on occasion about the events in Hong Kong around democracy and voting for elected officials and so forth. He joins us by Skype now from Hong Kong, and we've been talking about what's happening on the street and how that has affected things and what it reflects. But I'd like to go one step further with you, Michael, and ask about the negotiations, because there have been negotiations. There are certain things on the table, certain things more likely than not, to be granted. There are certain things that are not likely to ever be granted. And so this is, looking at it through the microscope, we see some really interesting processes going on, and I'd like to explore with you exactly what's being negotiated, who's negotiating, and what the negotiating considerations are. It's kind of like a lawyer's dream, isn't it?
Well, it was a major event here in town, and everybody was glued to the TVs, and TV screens were even set up in the protest area, and people were watching. But it was quite amazing, and in fact, it was covered. I remember a story in the New York Times, just amazed how this would actually take place. So you have 5 students who are like 20-year-olds, all sitting on one side of the table, and the number 2 person in the government, Carrie Lam, called the chief secretary, and her 2 ministers, the Minister of Justice and the Minister for Constitutional Affairs, sitting beside her, and 2 other officials. So the age gap between the negotiators was the visual image was quite stunning. Students wearing black T-shirts and the others wearing suits and ties.
Perfect.
In a room, and so they had this discussion. But as you could imagine, it was the first one. It lasted for 2 hours. It was televised. You can even Google it and see it if you want. They really seemed to all just be stating their positions. There wasn't that much response and interaction, in a sense. The government officials were lecturing the students on what they should do. They made a couple minor concessions. The students wanted them to file a supplemental report with the National People's Congress Standing Committee, who had issued the decision. And the government said, well, they would file that report with what's called the State Council instead, a kind of bureaucracy. The students haven't been too happy with that. They said, well, they wanted the report to go to the deciders, because then the deciders would have to think again about it and not send it to some office. And so that was done. The government also said that it would set up a sort of a standing body for a constitutional consultation with the public so that it gets a better sense of what the public wants and so on. So there were some kinds of sweeteners offered by the government, but not much. The government, of course, wanted the students to declare they would withdraw from the protest areas and free up the streets and so on, and they've refused to do so. Now the students have ordered a kind of a referendum, I guess you would say, in the square itself, where they would ask the protesters whether they should accept the government's offer and so on. Of course, they're expecting the protesters will all say no, and then they sort of strengthen their position for round 2 of the negotiation, if that is to take place. So it's generally believed that Beijing won't change its mind, and I think what the students did was very clever. Many of us have suggested they do this, and that is put pressure on the government to actually represent Hong Kong people. There's a perception in this town that the government only represents Beijing and lectures the public on Beijing's requirements. So there's this pressure in this discussion and these protests and so on. Students kept hammering, you guys have to stand up and fulfill your duties to implement democracy and blah, blah, blah under the basic law of Hong Kong. Now, people on the overseas where you are may be cynical. How can you do that with China? Well, China has implemented a free society in Hong Kong. All these protests are taking place. in an environment of freedom. People have rights. They have the rule of law. Hong Kong's rule of law is thought to be among the best in the world. And it's an open society. There's a free press. All of this is vigorously debated in the press. I'm often doing so myself in my op-ed opinions and so on. So we're not talking about implementing freedom or democracy in Shanghai. We're talking about Hong Kong. It's like talking about New York. Therefore, it becomes almost silly that they don't have democracy. How can you imagine New York without democracy? So this is the urge to say, well, it's China, why are you guys asking for silly things? Really doesn't apply that much. But then Beijing is going to be reluctant to step down unless the government somehow assists them in offering some other account that better represents Hong Kong views, because the government had earlier filed a report that everyone pretty much uniformly agrees misrepresented the public sentiment in Hong Kong and the concerns of Hong Kong people. So I think the student was pushing that, and the government's still pushing back, lecturing. We'll see if it gets to round 2.
And there was one meeting that was canceled, where the government canceled it a few days ago. They summarily decided, we're not going to meet with you. What happened there?
Well, that was the week before, so the meeting that actually took place this past Tuesday had been scheduled a week earlier, and the students had invited their supporters to the square and so on. The government said they were acting in bad faith by asking people to come out and sit in the square during the discussion, and so they called it off. But then they had second thoughts about it, and they came back and this time through the chief executive himself, promised to have these discussions. Now, whether discussions will go forward or not, there are also rumors coming out of the government yesterday that, well, if the students don't like what we're offering, we're just going to have to get tough. And so it's kind of a threat that we're going to send the police in and clear this mess up. Of course, the government knows if it does that, it's going to have more people on the street. So we're sort of at an impasse at the moment.
Yeah, I think it's worth mentioning the sort of the collective personality of the people in Hong Kong. They're used to democracy. What's happening here is repression of a previously, a previous democracy, and that really bothers people, I think. And it also means that they have a kind of "don't tread on me" attitude, and they will react if there is repression. Am I right?
Yeah, well, the thing is that they're not used to democracy, but they're used to an open society. They have a kind of half democracy. Half of the legislative council is elected. Under British colonialism, they didn't have democracy, but then Britain was a democracy, so the values of a democracy have been the values of Hong Kong. So the people have, in the years since the agreement to return Hong Kong was reached, they've developed a very robust civil society and a strong political culture. So in the context where the government is generally seen not to represent their interest to Beijing, the people have learned that, well, if the government's doing something we don't like, we have to go to the street and protest. So when the government tried to pass national security laws, 500,000 people took to the streets a decade ago. I was one of the Article 23 concern group members who wrote pamphlets and stuff for this. And we were surprised by the public support for that 500,000 demonstrators came out of it, and the government had to withdraw the bill. So there's this kind of culture where the government does things for Beijing's bidding from time to time, not every day, but sometimes. And when it does, the people tend to protest in the streets, and that's sort of what's going on at this moment.
Yeah. But it's been successful in the past, and so that it's sort of it's one of the tools in the arsenal of the people who care about open society.
Right.
But anyway, I wonder where you and other public intellectuals fit in all of this. Clearly, your rights to speak have not been abridged.
Right.
You can be, interviewed on global television. You can write, op-ed pieces for the newspaper. I guess especially the South China Morning Post.
Right.
And now you have a blog. That's a recent development. You have a blog that follows on all of this, making close contact of everything that happens. So, I mean, it's wonderful that you have the right to do that, but I wonder if, A, it has an effect on the student side, protest side, and B, whether it has an effect on the Beijing side. I mean, where do you play as a public intellectual in the process that's happening around you?
Yeah, there are a number of public intellectuals, and I think what you come to know as a scholar and writer is that you write things, and these things sometimes then they sort of spread into this to the intellectual life of the community, and people take them on board, and then sometimes it surprises you. You see your idea floating to the top in the public debate. And often it's almost by that time anonymous. It's not clear where that idea came from, but you know because you had a blank sheet of paper that you were writing on at one point. So I think people who do this kind of thing, and not here only, but also in America, you get used to the idea that as a public intellectual or writer, that your ideas, it takes time. You're not a dictator. You don't have the capacity to require this be the issue, but rather, like a government official may, rather you simply come into the public debate. And I think through your students, I mean, I've been training students here for a couple decades. So some of my students are actually now on both sides of this debate at the very top. So your ideas are everywhere. And I think that's kind of a motivation that it is important. Even this show that we're having here is important because it has impact on people's thinking and their ability to understand what's going on.
It must be gratifying at a certain level. I mean, as a public intellectual and as a law professor and so forth. But, you know, I wonder what would happen, Michael, if one of those 5 young 20-year-old students would call you or text you or say, look, we're having another meeting with the government. This is very important. There are a lot of important issues, including, you know, whether C.Y. Leung would be thrown out of office, exactly how our democracy would work here in Hong Kong. This is a, you know, sophisticated issue. We would like to have you there with us, Michael Davis. We'd like you to come down and join us at the meeting and negotiate with us and for us. Would you do that? And what would happen?
I think I would be reluctant to do it, not because I have any personal concern about it. I think it's better that local Chinese, ethnic Chinese people who are the dominant group in this society would do this. There's a danger that, you know, even when I've signed petitions, I ask my people who have approached me, and students have approached me. I've actually been interviewed by them. They ask whether I want to put my name on it, and sometimes I do because I have the status of a professor. But other times I would suggest that maybe you don't want a foreigner on there because there'll be accusations of foreign interference and so on. So I'm very careful about whether, I think voicing my views, I think I've acquired that status where I'm accepted as a public intellectual and someone can comment. But being out to negotiate or something, in the Article 23 debate, I was one of the 9 that was in a press conference every other day talking about it. But in this debate, I think I've focused more on trying to help the public, both here and abroad, to understand the issue. And I think it's better to have local activists and Democrats to be there in those meetings.
Wouldn't you be, last question, Michael, wouldn't you be concerned that this is really a game of, for Beijing, it's a game of wait them out? That if they can just keep a lid on this and not be too hard, be too soft, and not let it devolve into violence, and if they just keep it steady, after a while, the working stiff guys will say, enough already, I want to go back to work. My life is being affected. I want to go make a buck. I don't want all this trouble in the streets. Will you guys please stop? It's okay without making any gains. And then Beijing has its way. Beijing has achieved this simply by a standoff. And that would be their long plan, don't you think? I mean, wouldn't you be concerned about that being the result here?
I think that is exactly what they're doing. And they, after the episode with tear gas, they realized that was a huge blunder and that it just brought more crowds to the street. So their strategy since then has been a kind of wait and see, occasionally trying to shrink the space when they thought it would like to gain access, for example, for government workers to actually go to their office of work, and to this one main thoroughfare that they've now cleared, and it has buses passing on. So I think that has in fact been the strategy. I think in a way the Hong Kong protesters, even if Beijing does nothing, have changed the political culture in a way that's permanent. That now the governments in Beijing and Hong Kong have to be fully aware to be careful about doing things like this. Even the government in the meeting the other day actually says, well, even if we can't change it now, maybe the next election we can change it. They hadn't taken that position before. So they're even accepting that, you know, if this is a long-term game, it's not likely to produce immediate results. And I think people involved in this know that, but they're standing up and saying, look, we're Hong Kong people, we're going to defend our city. So don't you guys get any ideas that you're going to collapse us into the rest of China, into its repressive system. So I think that message has been loud and clear. And I think governments would ignore that message at their peril.
Very valuable, very valuable. Michael Davis, Constitutional Law and Human Rights Professor at the University of Hong Kong, joining us by Skype today. It's early in the morning, it's just after breakfast. Thank you so much for spending the time with us, Michael. I hope we can check back with you and get further status reports as we go down the line. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I enjoy it. It's my little visit home.